on a quiet cul-de-sac in Wisteria Ridge, the kind of neighborhood that marketed itself on manicured lawns and the illusion of harmony. Something cracked that afternoon. It wasn't loud. It didn't make headlines, but it shattered the illusion just the same. Officer Rick Halden stood on the Carter family porch, his hand on the grip of his firearm, knuckles tight, eyes narrowed. Across from him, Emmett Carter raised both hands slowly, palms trembling not from guilt, but from generations of conditioned caution. Between them stood Jasmine Carter, military veteran, decorated strategist, the kind of woman trained to stay calm under mortar fire. She didn't blink. The sun baked the white columns of the porch, casting long shadows that made the scene look more like a war front than a suburban homecoming. Jasmine's duffel bag was still at her feet. She had just returned from overseas. Her boots barely had time to dust Wisteria Ridge's pristine bricks before the neighborhood reminded her she didn't belong. Rick's voice cut through the air. Noise complaint. Disturbance from this property. His words were tight, practiced, the kind of script designed to justify force before it happened. Emmett's voice cracked in return. We've been inside all day. It didn't matter. Then came Denise Carter, mother, retired schoolteacher, dignified even in distress. She stepped onto the porch and placed a trembling hand on Jasmine's shoulder. Jasmine didn't move. Her spine was straight, her eyes locked on Rick's. The firearm twitched slightly in his grip before he took a breath and lowered it, muttering something about a warning. When the police car pulled away, the silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. Jasmine bent, picked up her bag, and walked inside without a word. The living room still smelled like old books and warm cinnamon. Jasmine sat, the weight of her gear pressing into the worn cushions. Emmett poured himself a glass of water, but his hand shook too badly to lift it to his lips. Denise sat beside him, her eyes glassy, searching for the right words. None came. That night, a single envelope slid into their mailbox. A violation notice. It read, "Porch decor in violation of aesthetic standards. Immediate removal required." It didn't mention that the flag in question, an American flag beside a Black Lives Matter banner, was the only one of its kind in the neighborhood. The next week brought more letters. The garden hose was too visible. The mailbox was painted the wrong shade of blue. The lawn was half an inch taller than code allowed. Each fine was a whisper of warning. Each envelope a reminder, assimilation or exile. Susan Whitmore's name wasn't on the letters, but her shadow hovered over every one. As president of the Wisteria Ridge Homeowners Association, she wielded bylaws like blades, cutting down anything that dared break the neighborhood's curated image. Her public face was friendly, polite, firm in the way a lock gate is firm. But inside HOA meetings, her voice sharpened, her eyes tightened. Her targets were chosen with surgical precision, and Rick Halden, her enforcer, made sure the message was clear. Susan liked to speak of order and standards. She liked to say things like protecting property value and maintaining visual harmony. But what she really protected was power, and what Jasmine's family disrupted was her illusion of control. The neighborhood, for the most part, stayed silent. Some watched from behind curtains. Some nodded tight-lipped when passing Emmett on the sidewalk. None spoke up. Not yet. But Jasmine watched, and listened, and remembered. She saw how the rules twisted only in certain directions. How homes with patriotic flags, wind chimes, or bright-colored paint went untouched, so long as they belonged to the right families. She walked the neighborhood at night, tracing the routes of the patrol cars, the flickers of security cameras installed by neighbors that seemed to point only one way. In her room, Jasmine opened a hard case lined with foam. Not weapons, not metals. A series of small recording devices, pinhole cameras, USB drives. She had brought them home from conflict zones, tools once used to expose war crimes and gather intelligence. Now, they would document something quieter, something more insidious. By the third week, Jasmine had over 20 hours of footage. Rick Halden pulling slowly into her driveway. Susan Whitmore circling the block in her luxury SUV. HOA volunteers taking photos of her father's garden while ignoring larger violations just a few doors down. Still, the Carters said nothing. Not yet. Jasmine knew timing mattered. This wasn't a fight of fists or fury. It was a siege, a war of attrition, and she had been trained to win those. Late one evening, Emmett sat on the porch, a quiet sigh escaping him. "Your mother wants to sell," he said, voice low. "She's tired. I can't blame her." Jasmine didn't answer. She only looked out over the street, eyes scanning every shadow, every window, every camera. She saw a war coming, one without rifles, but just as deadly. And like every war she'd ever fought, she would not enter it unprepared. What Susan Whitmore didn't know was that Jasmine Carter wasn't just a soldier. She was a strategist, and Wisteria Ridge had just become her battlefield. Rain fell softly over Wisteria Ridge the next morning, blanketing the neighborhood in a hush that felt artificial, like the quiet before a judge's gavel. Jasmine stood in the kitchen, watching the water bead on the window glass. Each droplet distorted the world outside. Fences looked taller, lawns darker, houses more hollow. Even the sunlight refused to stay long in this place. Denise moved quietly around the stove, her shoulders hunched as though expecting another envelope to appear on the doorstep. Emmett sat nearby with the newspaper, pretending to read, while his gaze flicked toward the mailbox every few minutes. Jasmine's phone buzzed. Another notice. This one listed unauthorized modifications to the flower bed, accusing her mother of planting tulips that disrupted neighborhood symmetry. Denise's hand stopped stirring. The spoon slipped, clattered against the pot. "I can't even plant tulips now," she whispered. Jasmine picked up the notice, studied it, then set it on the table. "They're pushing," she said, "trying to wear us down with paper cuts." The doorbell rang. Outside stood Susan Whitmore, clipboard in hand, umbrella tucked neatly over her shoulder. Her lips were painted the kind of red that masked venom with civility. "Good morning," she chirped. "I just wanted to check in personally about the recent notices. HOA guidelines can sometimes come across sterile, but we all want the same thing, harmony." Jasmine stepped forward, blocking her mother's view of the doorway. "Define harmony," she said. Susan's smile didn't falter, but her eyes tightened. "Consistency, cleanliness, a shared vision." "Whose vision?" Susan blinked once. "We do have protocols, Miss Carter. We welcome everyone who respects those." Jasmine didn't answer. She simply closed the door. Susan's heels tapped back down the walkway, crisp as a ticking clock. That night, Jasmine reviewed her recordings. She compiled every notice, every inconsistency, every photograph of other residents violating the same rules, without penalty. A file began to grow, thick, damning, meticulous. She created a timeline, cross-referenced names, logged every incident. But she wasn't just gathering evidence. She was watching people. Mrs. Chong from 2 blocks down, fined for a wind chime. Mr. and Mrs. Singh, warned about Diwali lights. The Nguyen family cited for excessive exterior decor. The pattern was so clean it stung. Jasmine printed copies of each violation, slipping them quietly into mailboxes after dark. She didn't sign them. She didn't need to. Those who had felt the cold sting of selective enforcement would know. 3 days later, her father came in with a quiet smile. "Leon Chong waved today," he said. "First time in weeks." Change didn't come in explosions. It came in whispers. Jasmine kept listening. The silence in Wisteria Ridge was no longer just avoidance. It was anticipation. A shift had begun, and Jasmine Carter was the storm moving in with it. The next storm didn't come from the sky. It came in the form of an urgent HOA bulletin, slipped beneath every door in Wisteria Ridge. The header read in bold red font, "Emergency Compliance Update." Below it, a list of expanded restrictions, retroactive to the start of the calendar year. New paint codes, seasonal decoration limits, lawn trimming frequency, and visual cohesion guidelines that were as vague as they were impossible to challenge. Jasmine read the document twice before lifting her eyes. "They're tightening the noose," she said quietly. Denise was in the corner, her knitting needle pausing midair. Emmett sat with his arms crossed, a look Jasmine had seen before in debriefing rooms, tired, braced for disappointment. "It's her way of silencing the mailers," Emmett said. "She knows someone's stirring the pot." But Jasmine wasn't just stirring. She was lighting a fuse. She had started a database, an encrypted, cloud-backed archive that cross-referenced race, incident type, timing, and enforcement pattern. There was no theory anymore. There was proof. Patterns emerged like oil on water, shiny, undeniable, sickening. She had photos of neighbors' houses, with blatant violations untouched for years, juxtaposed against her family citations for tulips and welcome mats. Then came the bird feeder. Walter Carter had spent the morning building a simple cedar feeder, a peace offering to himself, really. He loved birds. Always had. Jasmine watched him hang it gently under the old elm tree that stretched out over their lawn. He smiled as a pair of finches landed, pecked, fluttered. By noon, a violation notice appeared. Unauthorized wildlife attractant. Jasmine said nothing. She just clicked record on the camera. She had pointed at the feeder. That evening, the footage showed Rick Halden driving by slowly, not stopping, not warning, just watching, like a predator scenting where to strike next. Jasmine began printing the photos, laying them on the living room floor like puzzle pieces. Emmett joined her, then Denise. They said nothing, but in their silence, Jasmine felt the strength of shared purpose growing. Across town, Susan Whitmore held a special meeting. It was supposed to be confidential. Jasmine wasn't there, but her recording device, slipped beneath the podium earlier that day, captured every word. The situation with the Carters is escalating, Susan said. If we allow them to continue, others will follow. And we can't afford to lose control of the image we've built here. Control. Not community. Not safety. Control. Jasmine played the audio back at home, her jaw set. Then she emailed the clip, anonymously, to 3 addresses. One belonged to a journalist she trusted, one to a civil rights lawyer in the city, and the last to the HOA mailing list. The fuse was burning now. Outside, the bird feeder swung lightly in the breeze, framed by twilight. But it wasn't just a perch for birds anymore. It had become a symbol of quiet resistance, of beauty they couldn't criminalize, of a home that refused to apologize for existing. And across Wisteria Ridge, porch lights flicked on, one by one, as families began stepping out, curious, concerned, awakened. The air was changing. Jasmine Carter knew. The time for silence had passed. When night fell over Wisteria Ridge, it no longer brought peace. It brought murmurs of questions that had long gone unspoken, of eyes opening behind closed blinds. Jasmine Carter sat at her desk, her fingers stained with ink and red highlighter, circling timestamps, printing photos, and cross-referencing names. Her war board, taped neatly to the wall, now bloomed with strings of red yarn connecting faces, citations, camera footage, and whispered testimonies. The bird feeder had been the tipping point. She hadn't expected the impact to be so visceral. It was just a wooden box nailed to a branch. But when the violation arrived, families who had once stayed silent began leaving notes on her porch. Small things. Folded scraps of paper. Anonymous, handwritten, some shaky with fear. They said my flag was too political. They made me take down my lanterns. I didn't argue. I didn't want trouble. We're scared too. Jasmine read each one like classified intelligence, mapping a silent army of the subdued. Meanwhile, Susan Whitmore doubled down. New patrol routes were established. HOA meetings were held weekly now. She gave interviews on the local community page about the importance of neighborhood standards and the dangers of escalating disrespect. She smiled in every picture. Pearls, pastels, and poison behind her teeth. Rick Halden, for his part, didn't hide anymore. His patrol car now parked near the Carter residence every other evening. No tickets, no words, just presence. A warning dressed in uniform. But Jasmine was done reading warnings. She began to leave her blinds open when she worked late into the night. Let them watch. Let them know she wasn't going anywhere. Denise, who had once begged for calm, now sat beside her with a cup of tea and helped label files. Emmett, once broken by fear, now walked their dog 2 times a day. Chin high, eyes forward. The Carters weren't hiding. Not anymore. The real shift came a week later, during a community cleanup day, organized annually by the HOA. It was usually a photo op for Susan Whitmore and her board of hand-picked allies. Matching t-shirts, gloves, press-ready smiles. This time, Jasmine showed up with her parents. They weren't alone. The Singh family came too, bringing their teenage sons. Then Gwen's arrived with gardening tools. Mrs. Chong wore a sari and a fierce expression. Every family that had once feared standing out was suddenly showing up, wearing their cultural garments, waving politely, but not smiling. It wasn't an ambush. It was presence, and presence was power. Susan's smile strained as she noticed the shift. The photos she'd planned to take no longer featured her curated narrative. They featured unity, not her brand of sameness, but real unity. Diversity standing shoulder to shoulder, trimming hedges, sweeping sidewalks, picking up trash under the same cloudy sky. At one point, Jasmine caught Susan whispering to Rick, who'd arrived to supervise the cleanup. Rick scanned the growing crowd, his jaw tight, and walked off without saying a word. The moment didn't end with applause. It ended with something far more powerful. A knowing glance exchanged between strangers, a quiet nod between families who had never spoken. Jasmine didn't need a podium. She had presence, and the neighborhood was watching. That night, Jasmine uploaded her first full report, titled, Pattern of Discriminatory Enforcement, Wisteria Ridge HOA. It contained photographic evidence, video clips, audio recordings, and timestamps. It read like a prosecution file. No emotion, just facts. Cold, inarguable. She sent it to the civil rights lawyer again, this time with her name attached. The response came swiftly. Let's talk Monday. You've got a case. Jasmine stared at the email. For a second, the house was silent except for the hum of the fridge and the distant chirp of night insects. Denise walked in, wrapped in her robe, her face tired but proud. You ready for this? She asked. Jasmine didn't look up. I've been ready since the day I got home. Outside, the porch light flickered. Somewhere in the dark, a camera turned. But inside, for the first time in weeks, Jasmine Carter allowed herself the luxury of hope. The lawsuit hadn't even been filed yet, but the air in Wisteria Ridge shifted like a pressure drop before a storm. By Monday morning, whispers turned to glances, and glances turned to quiet conversations at mailboxes and backyard fences. Jasmine noticed it in the way people hesitated before waving, unsure whether they were witnessing history or about to become casualties of it. Susan Whitmore noticed it too. A new letter arrived that afternoon, unlike the others. No accusation, no citation, just a friendly reminder of the HOA's mission, to preserve the beauty and safety of Wisteria Ridge. The letter closed with a line that settled like acid on Jasmine's tongue. We thank all residents who continue to support unity by respecting our vision. Unity, a word that had been stretched and broken until it no longer resembled what it meant. Jasmine tucked the letter into her file, right behind the footage of Rick Halden circling the block 4 times in 1 hour the night before. Later that evening, Jasmine received a phone call. A block number. Her instincts sharpened, but she answered. Miss Carter. A man's voice measured calm. My name is Maurice Dupree. I'm a former HOA board member. I used to live in Wisteria Ridge. Moved 2 years ago. I heard what you're doing. I think I can help. His voice carried the kind of weariness Jasmine recognized. Someone who had fought and lost, but still wanted to see someone else win. They agreed to meet at a diner just outside the neighborhood. Jasmine brought a copy of her report. Maurice brought something better, testimony. She's been doing this for years, he said, tapping the tabletop as he spoke. Same playbook. Selective enforcement. Silencing complaints. If a family challenged a violation, she'd raise their dues or initiate anonymous complaints from concerned neighbors. I tried to push back once. She called a special vote and ousted me within 2 weeks. He slid a flash drive across the table. Board meeting recordings, old emails, screenshots. I kept them after I left. Didn't think anyone would ever take her on. Jasmine didn't smile, but she nodded. That night, as she loaded the files into her archive, her timeline began to double in size. Names she hadn't connected before, patterns stretching back 5, 6, even 10 years. The foundation of Susan's control wasn't just power. It was fear, cemented over time through subtle punishment. And now, that foundation had cracks. The next morning, Jasmine walked the block. She did it slowly, deliberately, letting herself be seen. The Vietnamese couple across the street nodded. Mrs. Singh raised 2 fingers in a quiet sign of solidarity. Even the Johnsons, a black family who'd long kept to themselves, offered a wave from their porch. That night, another envelope arrived. Not a violation, a warning. Typed, no return address. But Jasmine recognized the language. You are bringing unnecessary attention to yourself and your family. Be careful what you stir. Not all neighbors forgive. Emmett held the letter between 2 fingers like it was radioactive. Denise said nothing, but her hand trembled against her glass. Jasmine stared at it for a long moment. Then she walked to the living room, added it to the board with a red pen, and stepped back. If they're threatening, she said softly, then they're scared. The next day, the silence broke. A post appeared on the Wisteria Ridge community page. Anonymous, but written like a manifesto. It outlined years of selective HOA enforcement. It referenced Jasmine's report, and it ended with a question that echoed like thunder. Are we neighbors, or are we inmates in someone else's vision? It didn't take long for Susan to respond. A town hall was announced, mandatory attendance. Thursday night, the HOA was addressing recent confusion and restoring order. Jasmine knew what it meant. A last stand. She prepared her footage. She built a slideshow of evidence. Not dramatic, just quiet facts, neatly lined up like dominoes waiting to fall. She knew Susan would come armed with protocol and policy. But Jasmine had something better, the truth, and a growing crowd that no longer wanted to live in fear. That night, Jasmine walked outside and sat beside her father. The bird feeder swayed lightly above them. Denise joined, wrapped in a shawl. No one spoke, but somewhere in the dark, another porch light clicked on. Then another, and another. Not one explosion, but a spark. And Jasmine Carter knew the fire was coming. The Wisteria Ridge Town Hall felt more like a courtroom than a community meeting. The venue was a community clubhouse, a pristine structure with white crown molding, polished hardwood floors, and that sterile scent of lemon cleaner. Rows of identical gray chairs faced a dais, where the HOA board sat in full regalia, with Susan Whitmore front and center like a monarch surveying her queendom. Her blouse was crisp, her smile serene, her pearl necklace resting just above a heart that beat for power, not people. Residents shuffled in, some nervous, others curious. A few came with printouts of Jasmine's anonymous dossier, now quietly circulating through inboxes like contraband. Jasmine entered last, deliberately. Her steps were measured, her gaze direct. No camouflage, no armor. Just her composed, alert and ready. Susan tapped the microphone. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice wrapped in honey. There's been quite a bit of misinformation spreading lately. We're here tonight to clarify, to unify, and to remind each other what this community stands for. Unity again. Jasmine nearly scoffed. Susan launched into a presentation filled with platitudes. Photos of blooming flower beds, clean sidewalks, happy block parties from years past. But Jasmine noticed the subtle manipulation. Every image featured white families. Every slide reinforced a message. Conformity equals peace. Then came the pivot. Unfortunately, Susan continued, some residents have chosen to misrepresent our policies, to sow division, to defame the association with reckless accusations. She didn't say Jasmine's name. She didn't have to. Every pair of eyes shifted. Jasmine stood, and the room held its breath. May I? She asked, her voice calm. Susan smiled tightly. This isn't a debate forum, Miss Carter. But before Susan could gavel her down, an older man, Mr. Ellis from Maple Lane, spoke up. Let her talk. Others murmured in agreement. Jasmine stepped to the front. She didn't use the podium. She didn't need to elevate herself. The truth would do that. She reached into her bag and pulled out a laptop, connecting it to the projector with a practiced flick of her wrist. The screen flickered, then settled on an image. A timeline of violations issued over the last 2 years. 37 citations to residents of color, she began. 5 to white families, for the same infractions. A hush swept through the room. Click. Next slide. Recordings of Officer Halden circling our home 10 times in 1 week, without cause. Click. Next slide. Audio from an HOA board meeting. Susan's voice saying, "If we allow them to continue, others will follow." Susan's composure cracked for the first time. Her mouth twitched, and her fingers clenched the arm of her chair. But Jasmine wasn't done. She held up the bird feeder violation. "My father was cited for this," she said. "Unauthorized wildlife attracted. But 2 streets over, a white family installed an identical one 2 years ago. Still up. Still untouched." Gasps. Whispers. A shifting tide. Susan tried to interject. "These are taken out of context." "Then let's talk context." Jasmine cut in. "Let's talk about the families fined for wind chimes, holiday decorations, even welcome mats. All immigrants. All minorities. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern." Behind her, Denise and Emmett watched. Her mother's hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her father blinked rapidly, the way he used to when holding back tears. Jasmine looked across the crowd. "This isn't just about my family. This is about what kind of neighborhood we are. What kind of silence we've been told to live in. What kind of rules we enforce, and on whom." For a moment, no one moved. Then Mr. Singh stood. "We were fined for putting lights out for Diwali." Mrs. Chong followed. "My wind chimes were removed while I was at work. No warning." The Johnsons added. "We were told our porch chairs didn't match community colors." Voices rose. Dozens now. All with stories. All with scars. Susan banged the gavel. "Enough. This meeting is out of order." But the crowd had tasted truth. They weren't letting it go. A young woman from the back stood. Motioned to remove Susan Whitmore as HOA president. Gasps again. Another voice. Seconded. Susan's mouth fell open. "You can't. This is an official procedure." But the rules she'd weaponized for years now turned against her. The room broke into argument, yes, but also awakening. Residents who had never spoken to each other now exchanged nods, testimonies, support. Unity, not in fear, but in defiance of it, began to take root. Jasmine stepped back, letting the fire she'd sparked rage forward on its own. She didn't need the last word. The truth had it for her. The meeting didn't end that night. It unraveled. By the time the clubhouse emptied, Wisteria Ridge no longer looked like a curated community, but a fault line after the first quake. The air buzzed with whispers and the sound of fractured loyalties being reassembled into something new. Jasmine didn't linger. She walked home in silence, her boots crunching softly on the gravel, the night wind brushing against her face like a quiet applause. She had come into the room alone, but she didn't walk out that way. By morning, everything had changed. Susan Whitmore's name still stood atop the HOA website, but rumors swirled like autumn leaves in a storm. Several board members had submitted formal resignations overnight. Others began answering emails with measured neutrality, their once icy tone replaced by words like inclusive review and temporary suspension of certain enforcement actions. But Jasmine knew this wasn't the end. Bureaucracy doesn't bleed, it recalibrates. She could feel the next move stirring in the shadows, and it came not in a letter or a face-to-face confrontation, but through absence. Rick Halden vanished. For 5 days, his cruiser didn't crawl past the Carter house. No drive-bys, no phantom reports, no ticket slips tucked under wipers. The silence was too sharp, too deliberate. Jasmine felt it immediately, like a sniper shifting position, not surrendering. And then, one night, as she returned from a walk, she found the evidence. Her father's bird feeder, shattered. Splinters of cedar and scattered seeds lay beneath the elm. Not the wind, not raccoons. Jasmine had secured the feeder with weather-grade steel hooks, military-grade, ironically. Someone had wrenched it down with purpose. She stood there for a long time, her fists tightening, not from rage, but from recognition. The message was clear. The war hadn't ended. It had just become quiet again. Inside, Emmett inspected the damage without a word. Denise swept the porch in silence, the broom scratching across the boards like a whisper of sorrow. Jasmine retrieved the security footage, grainy but clear. A shadowy figure in uniform, a fast hand, a quiet retreat. Rick. The next morning, Jasmine didn't eat. She drove into the city instead, laptop beside her, files organized by name, timestamp, and violation type. She entered a law office housed in an aging brick building downtown, a firm that specialized in housing discrimination and civil litigation. She met with a lawyer named Marcus Bell, young, sharp-eyed, and visibly stunned by the evidence she dropped on his conference table. "This," he said slowly, scanning the documents, "is bigger than just HOA harassment. This is systemic targeting under the guise of policy. If you're willing, Miss Carter, this could go federal." "I'm willing," she said. Marcus gave a small nod. "You're going to rattle some cages." "I was trained for that," she answered. Back in Wisteria Ridge, the whispers turned to movement. More families stepped forward. The Changs, the Nguyen's, the Singhs, and the Johnsons began meeting, not in secret, but openly. Jasmine hosted them in her living room, over mugs of coffee and plates of cornbread and plantains and dumplings. Stories flowed. So did strategies. One family had been fined for raising a Ghanaian flag during Independence Week. Another was told their driveway paint violated HOA color codes, though it had been there for years before they moved in. The more they spoke, the more they uncovered a pattern that had, for years, gone unchecked because it had gone unnamed. Jasmine didn't lead these gatherings. She simply asked questions, took notes, listened. The real revolution, she knew, didn't come from a hero, but from 100 neighbors deciding not to be afraid anymore. Word spread fast. A local news crew appeared, setting up cameras outside the Carter home, asking about the decorated veteran challenging suburban injustice. Jasmine refused interviews. This wasn't about spotlight. It was about exposure. The documents she'd shared with Marcus had already triggered an official inquiry from the state's Fair Housing Commission. And that's when the retaliation escalated. Late one evening, Jasmine returned home to find their porch defaced. Graffiti sprayed across the siding in angry black scrawl. "Keep the peace or leave." Emmett scrubbed it the next morning. Denise cried quietly as she painted over it. Jasmine watched from the curb, her phone in hand, dialing the same journalist who had received the first anonymous leak. "It's time," she said. "Tell the whole story." Within 48 hours, the story hit public airwaves. Suburb under fire. HOA accused of racial targeting in Wisteria Ridge. Jasmine's footage played in the background, cropped faces, redacted names, but the message came through like thunder. The comments exploded online. Support, outrage, solidarity. Susan Whitmore tried to release a statement. It read like something written in a panic room. Hollow, defensive. The HOA board scrambled to distance themselves. But it was too late. Jasmine had already pulled the veil. As she sat on the porch that night, the breeze cool and still, neighbors began to stop by, not to ask questions, but to say thank you. Mrs. Chong brought egg tarts. The Johnsons left sunflowers. Mr. Ellis dropped off an old war medal he said had belonged to his father. "You're a soldier," he told her, "just fighting a different kind of enemy." Jasmine Carter said nothing. She didn't need to. The war was shifting, but her mission wasn't over yet. By dawn, the silence in Wisteria Ridge had turned brittle. The kind of quiet that didn't bring peace, but prelude. Jasmine felt it in the air, like the hush before a sniper's shot, or the stillness in the jungle before the ambush. Her body knew it before her mind did. Years in uniform had tuned her senses to danger dressed as calm. The neighborhood was watching her now, more openly. Some windows held eyes behind curtains. Some lawns had new flags waving beside the old ones. Not all were messages of support. Some were warnings. The lines had been drawn, and the Carter family stood, unmistakably, in the eye of the storm. And yet, Jasmine wasn't afraid. She'd faced men with rifles and radios in war zones who smiled before they struck. Susan Whitmore wasn't half as clever. The HOA head had vanished from public view, but not from control. Her allies, the ones with deep pockets and polished smiles, began to surface. A smear campaign followed, quick and coordinated. One morning, a glossy flyer appeared in mailboxes. It featured a photograph of Jasmine, arms crossed on her porch, a cropped image of her military uniform beside a blurry security camera still of the porch graffiti. Bold red font asked, "Is she the threat?" Her parents were horrified. Emmett crumpled the flyer in his fist. Denise sat down slowly on the couch, tears forming before words could. Jasmine remained still, the flyer in her lap, her expression unreadable. "It's desperation," she finally said. "She's losing ground, so she's setting fire to the forest." But fire, Jasmine knew, only works when the roots aren't deep, and hers were. The next evening, Jasmine met Marcus Bell again, this time at a town hall meeting arranged by the Fair Housing Commission. The public hearing had drawn media, state officials, and a quiet tension that wrapped around every folding chair in the school auditorium. Jasmine sat in the front row, her parents beside her, and the families of Wisteria Ridge lined the rows like a united front. Susan Whitmore arrived late, draped in beige, hair pinned tightly, with a smile like wet paper. Her lawyer whispered into her ear. Rick Halden did not appear. The commissioner opened the floor for testimonies. Jasmine stood slowly, her boots echoing across the floor. No uniform this time. No salutes or stripes. Just truth. "I didn't come back from overseas to wage war with garden gnomes and mailbox paint," she began. "But what I came back to was a battlefield in disguise. One where the bullets are paper notices and the wounds look like fines, fear, and silence." She laid out the data, the recordings, the timeline. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She just spoke, with the precision of a soldier and the patience of someone who knew justice moved like molasses before it boiled over. When she finished, the room didn't clap. It just breathed, deeply, slowly, as if everyone had been holding their breath for years. Other neighbors followed. Mrs. Nguyen, with her hands trembling as she recounted being fined for holiday lights. Mr. Singh, his voice thick, describing how his son stopped riding his bike out front for fear of being watched. Family after family stepped forward, not to attack, but to reveal. Susan's face never changed, but her lawyer began furiously taking notes. The commission promised an investigation, promised accountability, promised enforcement of anti-discrimination laws. But Jasmine had learned long ago, promises meant nothing without pressure. She wasn't done yet. Back in Wisteria Ridge, something extraordinary happened. Porch by porch, driveways began to change. Flags of different nations fluttered alongside American ones. Murals appeared on fences. Tulips were replanted, dozens of them, from one end of the block to the other. It wasn't protest. It was declaration. The HOA inbox crashed from the volume of complaints, this time against Susan Whitmore and the remaining board. Photos of uniform enforcement discrepancies, recorded HOA meetings, anonymous testimonies from former enforcers who had been pressured to issue selective fines. And then, on a Thursday morning that started like any other, Jasmine received a single-page email from Marcus. Subject line, settlement offer from HOA Legal. She opened it. Read the text once, then twice. They wanted to settle, quietly. An apology buried in legalese. A payout to the Carter family. A promise of structural reform to HOA policies. A clause of confidentiality. Jasmine stared at it. Emmett and Denise waited, saying nothing. Her mother held her hand. Her father nodded once. Jasmine closed the laptop without replying. Some wars, she thought, don't end with explosions, but with echoes. That night, she printed the offer, tacked it on the community board outside the HOA clubhouse, and beneath it, in bold black marker, she wrote one word: cowards. She wasn't here for hush money. She was here for change. And Wisteria Ridge had only just begun to wake up. The night Jasmine posted the settlement offer on the community board, a gust of wind swept through Wisteria Ridge like the breath of something old finally exhaling. The paper flapped, rippling under the porch lights like a warning flag. But it wasn't fear it carried. It was defiance. By morning, someone had torn it down. But it didn't matter. Enough neighbors had seen it, taken photos, whispered to each other as they passed on morning walks or school drop-offs. The neighborhood was no longer hiding behind hedges and polite nods. They were watching, waiting for what came next. And Jasmine was ready. She didn't need to burn down the HOA. She needed to expose the rot that held it together. That afternoon, she returned to the HOA clubhouse alone. A single-story building with beige siding and a dull metal door. It looked more like a storage shed than the nucleus of control it had become. She had scheduled a formal meeting under her rights as a homeowner. Susan Whitmore had no choice but to show up. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. A long table stretched across the center, lined with chairs too stiff and sterile to be welcoming. Jasmine took a seat at the head, waiting with the calm stillness of someone who had walked through fire before. Susan arrived 5 minutes late, flanked by 2 board members and her attorney. She smiled, thin and practiced. The lawyer looked bored, until Jasmine opened her folder. She laid out copies of internal emails, recordings transcribed, minutes from HOA meetings that had been selectively omitted from official logs, a copy of the neighborhood charter, annotated to show all the provisions Susan and her board had quietly altered over the years, often without full vote. The lawyer sat up. "This," Jasmine said, tapping a page, "is a list of fines issued in the last 3 years. 93% went to families who were either minorities or immigrants. This," she continued, pulling out another sheet, "is a statement from your former treasurer, confirming that you altered financial records to overcharge those same households on annual dues." Susan didn't speak. Her fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. "And this," Jasmine finished, "is a sworn affidavit from a security consultant who confirms that at least 6 of the surveillance cameras placed by the HOA were angled illegally toward private windows, not public spaces." The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable. Jasmine leaned forward. "You want to control. You built it out of fear and silence. But here's the thing about silence. It cracks. And when it does, people remember how to speak." Susan's lawyer reached for the documents. Jasmine pulled them back. "These are already with my legal team," she said. "And the press. And the Fair Housing Commission. You don't get to bury this." Susan finally spoke, voice trembling just beneath the surface. "What do you want?" Jasmine looked at her, not with anger, but with something colder clarity. "I want you gone. I want every person you targeted to receive restitution. I want the HOA charter rewritten with oversight. I want Rick Halden investigated. And I want the community to know the truth." Susan's mouth opened as if to protest, but nothing came. Jasmine stood, collected her documents, and walked to the door. Before she left, she turned back. "You built a kingdom on paper cuts and petty rules. I'm here to turn every one of them into a scar you'll never hide." Outside, the sky was unusually clear, like the air after a storm has finally spent its rage. Jasmine stepped into the sun, her shadow long on the pavement. Later that week, the news broke. The local station ran the story first. Wisteria Ridge HOA accused of discriminatory practices, internal corruption. Then the larger outlets picked it up. Interviews followed. Jasmine declined them all. She didn't need the spotlight. She needed results. Susan resigned that Friday. So did the 2 board members who had flanked her. Rick Halden was placed under investigation by Internal Affairs, and neighbors began to come forward with their own encounters, some stretching back years. The Fair Housing Commission announced plans to appoint a federal mediator to oversee all HOA activities in Wisteria Ridge for the next 18 months. A new board election was scheduled. This time, ballots would be mailed to every homeowner. The Singh family repainted their porch in bright orange. Then Gwyn's added a koi pond. Mrs. Chong put her wind chimes back up and added another for good measure. And on one particular Sunday afternoon, families gathered for what someone jokingly called the Wisteria Ridge Unity Barbecue. Flags waved of different nations, identities, and beliefs. There was music, laughter, the kind that rose from shared struggle and hard-won ground. Jasmine stood in the background, arms crossed, watching, not needing to lead, just witnessing. A small girl, maybe 6 or 7, ran past her with a paper flag in her hand and turned back to wave. Jasmine smiled. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was the beginning of something new. The press didn't knock. It roared in, uninvited but inevitable, as if truth had been biding its time, waiting just long enough to corner Wisteria Ridge in its own mirror. The HOA corruption story hit the morning cycle on local news, then went regional, and by nightfall, a national outlet had tagged it as a quiet war in suburbia. But Jasmine Carter didn't watch the television. She sat outside beneath the same elm tree where her father had once hung the bird feeder. It was gone now, removed after the final citation, but she still heard the birds. They sang like witnesses who'd seen too much, but survived anyway. The neighborhood was different now. Not transformed, not healed, just different. Tense, alert, awakened. The lines drawn by decades of quiet discrimination were still there, but so were the people now standing beside them, calling them what they were. Jasmine had spent years tracking insurgents, warlords, and dictators who used fear to control. She never thought she'd encounter the same tactics dressed in khakis and HOA badges. But oppression was adaptable. It didn't always wear camouflage. Sometimes it wore pearls and a name tag that read community chairperson. Susan Whitmore had resigned under pressure. Her lawyer had tried to strike a deal, but the weight of the evidence crushed any negotiation. Financial misconduct, targeted citations, racial profiling. Each document Jasmine had collected became a nail sealing Susan's reputation shut in a box labeled abuse of power. But Rick Halden was a different beast. His badge still gave him access. His silence, more dangerous than any weapon, lingered like smog. The department had announced an internal investigation, but Jasmine knew better. Internal meant invisible. Internal meant quietly swept away. So she didn't wait. She filed a civil complaint, not just as a homeowner, but as a citizen with a decorated military record and the video footage to back every claim. She sent a full dossier to the Civilian Review Board and the local ACLU chapter. She CC'd the news outlets, too. If they wanted silence, she gave them sound. Undeniable, echoing sound. And then something happened that no one had predicted. A letter arrived from a woman Jasmine didn't know. Lourdes Rivera, a Latina mother of 3 from a different subdivision miles away. The letter was handwritten. They did the same thing to us. It began. We didn't know how to fight back. But now we're watching you. And we're learning. Behind every unjust policy, there's a pattern. And behind every pattern, a network. That week, Jasmine started a community coalition. Quietly, strategically, not as a protester, but as a planner. The families who once only waved from behind curtains now stepped forward, bringing HOA violations, photos, letters, even audio clips. One woman had recorded Susan ranting in. The town hall was never built for this kind of crowd. Folding chairs lined the walls, stacked rows upon rows, as people stood shoulder to shoulder. The air felt charged, electric with something long suppressed. The scent of fresh paper mixed with warm bodies and cool resentment. Microphones sat perched on their stands like silent judges, waiting. And at the center of it all, Jasmine Carter sat in the 3rd row. No longer a ghost in the neighborhood, but a mirror held up to it. The meeting was scheduled to discuss community cohesion, a vague term tossed around to mask what was really happening. It was a reckoning. HOA members looked rattled. New faces had filled the board, many appointed after Susan Whitmore's resignation. Rick Halden was notably absent, on administrative leave pending review. But Jasmine knew better than to celebrate too soon. Systems didn't unravel from a single blow. They eroded slowly, one exposed truth at a time. When Jasmine stepped up to the podium, the room hushed like a theater moments before curtain. She didn't bring notes. She didn't need them. "My name is Jasmine Carter," she began, her voice even, clear, trained. "Some of you know me as the daughter of Emmett and Denise Carter. Some only know me as the woman with the bird feeder. And some, until recently, preferred not to know me at all." A few heads turned. Most remained still. But I'm here to say this isn't just about my family. It's about how this community defines community. About who gets to feel safe, seen, heard. We cannot build unity on the backs of those we silence. There was no applause. Not yet. Just listening. And that was enough. After the meeting, people approached her in quiet waves. some to apologize, others to offer support. One man pressed a thumb drive into her palm. I recorded the meeting where they talked about raising dues selectively. It's yours. Back home, Jasmine opened her laptop and added the new files to her growing archive. But this wasn't about revenge. It never was. It was about truth. About reminding people that silence doesn't equal peace. It just buys time for injustice to root deeper. Months passed. The Carters repainted their mailbox. Not because they had to, but because they wanted a brighter color. The tulips bloomed again in Denise's garden. The bird feeder was rehung by Emmett with shaking but proud hands. Neighbors began stopping by, sometimes for a chat, sometimes to ask Jasmine how they could start a neighborhood watch that wasn't about surveillance, but about safety. The coalition grew. Other communities reached out. Stories poured in from across the state. Stories that echoed with the same subtle cruelty hidden behind policy and protocol. Jasmine helped some file complaints. Others she connected with civil rights groups. Her military skills had found a new battlefield, and this one was personal. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low behind the elm tree, Denise stepped outside and handed Jasmine a photo. It was of Jasmine as a child, maybe 7 years old, saluting next to an American flag in front of the same house they now fought to keep. "I kept this," Denise said softly, "for the day you'd need to remember who you are, not who they say you are." Jasmine held the photo. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just nodded, because the truth was she never forgot. And when the final investigative report came in months later, validating the pattern of discrimination, triggering a state audit of multiple HOAs, she didn't celebrate. She read it, highlighted it, archived it, and moved on to the next family, who had just received their first violation notice. Justice, she learned, wasn't a finish line. It was a rhythm, a long, slow song sung by those who refused to let silence win. So to the ones watching this video, who feel the weight of rules that don't protect you, who walk streets where you're seen as an outsider in your own home, ask yourself this. What would you do when silence becomes complicity? Would you speak? Would you organize? Would you stand? If this story moved you, share it. If it made you think, like it. And if you believe more people need to hear stories like Jasmine's, subscribe. Because sometimes change doesn't knock. It marches in.